Medieval Europe, a period often romanticized in tales of valiant knights and mythical quests, was in reality a horrifying descent into darkness. For those who might think they could hack it in such a savage era, imagine existing daily under the constant shadow of death. A simple sword slash or a drawn-out illness could end your life, and survival was a lottery you might tragically lose. As you step back into this dark period, you'd think you could endure it after all. History's legends make the past seem like a simpler time. But don't be fooled. The truth is a haunting nightmare. In medieval Europe, the specter of death loomed over every aspect of life. Your lifespan was measured not in decades or centenaries, but in mere seconds or hours. A clash of swords could end your life as quickly as you drew breath. And diseases like the plague swept through communities, leaving nothing but despair and death in their wake. Even the most fundamental functions, like drinking water from an unfiltered source, could be a death sentence. Amidst this, you might wonder, could you truly survive in such a perilous setting? Could you navigate the chaos and carnage of medieval Europe for even a single day? Think you have what it takes to endure the horrors that lay ahead? Well, the reality of medieval Europe is a harsh awakening. The streets are not the quaint cobblestone paths of fairy tales, but treacherous mazes of garbage, waste, and danger. Every corner could harbor a pickpocket, or worse, an assassin lurking in the shadows. Castles, often seen as symbols of medieval grandeur, are in reality cold, damp fortresses where life is equally precarious. Inside these walls, you're not safe from the elements or the intrigues of the nobility. It's a world where your survival is a gamble, and luck is the only currency that matters. The Middle Ages were not a land of chivalrous knights and fair maidens. It was a brutal reality of blood, guts, and grinding poverty. Knights were often little more than mercenaries, and warfare was a brutal affair where prisoners were not taken and there was no mercy shown. The very notion of chivalry was more a myth than a reality. The idea of courtly love was confined to the pages of romance novels. Women had little value in this male-dominated society except as property. The concept of human rights was alien to the medieval mindset. Torture was commonplace, and justice was arbitrary. Life in medieval Europe was a struggle for existence, and it was a struggle you might not win. The air you breathe is thick with the stench of decay. Disease is rampant, and the medical understanding is rudimentary at best, often leading to more harm than good. A visit to the doctor could be a death sentence in itself. The so-called healers of the time had little to offer but pain and misery. The Black Death, which ravaged Europe in the 14th century, was a grim harbinger of what life was like during this period. People were dying left and right, and the relentless march of death showed no signs of stopping. You navigate through the rotting streets, you witness firsthand the grim reality of medieval life. People are dropping dead in the streets, their bodies bloated and decaying. The stench is overwhelming, and the sight is sickening. This is not the romanticized vision of the past. This is the raw, unvarnished truth of life in medieval Europe. There is no escape from the stench of death, and it seems that death itself is closing in on you. The question is not whether you will die, but when. How long can you endure the horrors of medieval Europe before succumbing to its grim embrace? The reality is stark and terrifying. Medieval Europe was a graveyard of hopes and dreams, and you're just another soul who might soon rest in its cold, dark ground. The Middle Ages may seem like a distant, romanticized part of history, but in reality, it was a nightmare from which you might never awaken. The cobbled streets, the looming castles, the very air you breathe in this so-called age of chivalry are all a deadly trap. To survive here, you need more than courage and strength. You need a miracle. And miracles don't often happen in the dark, brutal world of medieval Europe. Medieval Europe was not for the faint of heart. Life was tough, death was even tougher. While we may scoff at the old wives' tales of our ancestors, like the belief that inhaling a witch's poisonous breath could kill you, the reality of their lives was far more sinister. Diseases like the bubonic plague, leprosy, tuberculosis, and smallpox stalked the populace, turning the streets into a macabre game of life and death. And you'd be hard-pressed to find a knight in shining armor to save you. Picture yourself stepping into a bustling medieval market. The air is alive with the sounds of bartering, the smell of spices, and the laughter of children. But beneath this veneer of normalcy, a silent killer lurks. The Black Death, one of the most notorious plagues in history, was a horrifying dance between humans and rodents. As you navigate through the crowded stalls, you can't help but notice the growing number of people who appear unwell, their faces pale, their limbs swollen. Unbeknownst to you, a tiny bacteria, Yersinia pestis, is silently wreaking havoc on their bodies. The worst part, it's hitching a ride on fleas that make their home on rats. And rats, as it turns out, are as common in medieval cities as they are unwelcome. This microscopic menace is the Grim Reaper in disguise. It has no respect for social standing, wealth, or power. It strikes swiftly and mercilessly, turning a cough into a death sentence. As you make your way back home, the weight of what you've seen begins to sink in. The carefree laughter of the market now echoes mockingly in your ears. Your home, once a sanctuary, now seems like a potential tomb. Even the most basic acts of life, like eating, become fraught with danger. Contaminated food or water could be your last meal. Inhaling the wrong breath, well, that might just be your final breath. Every interaction, every handshake, every embrace becomes a gamble with death. In medieval Europe, there was no escape from this silent, invisible enemy. You wake up in the middle of the night, your dreams plagued by visions of the sick and dying.
Outside the wind whispers tales of a world turned upside down.
The sun, once a bringer of life, now casts long, eerie shadows on the city. The familiar streets seem alien and menacing. The stench of rotting garbage mingles with the even more disturbing odor of decaying bodies. Too many people have died, and death is only the beginning. In those moments of quiet desperation, you might find yourself yearning for the simple things in life. A clean glass of water, fresh food, or just a moment of peace. But in medieval Europe, even these basic desires could be a luxury. The relentless grip of disease makes every day an uphill battle. The nights are filled with the cries of the dying, the days with the stench of the dead. The vibrant colors of life seem to fade into the grim palette of decay. It's a world where hope flickers like a candle in the wind, threatened by the suffocating darkness of death. And yet life goes on. Amidst this grim backdrop, the resilience of the human spirit shines through. People pray, they sing, they tell stories to keep their spirits alive. Communities rally together, sharing their meager resources, trying to make sense of the senseless. In the darkest hours, they find solace in each other. Love, friendship, faith, these become their lifelines in a sea of death. As you navigate this treacherous world, you realize that survival is more than just a physical challenge. It's a mental and emotional marathon. Fear, grief, despair, these are your constant companions. But amidst the ruins of a dying world, the seeds of hope are planted. The cycle of life and death plays out, reminding you that even in the darkest times, life finds a way to endure. The sun still rises, the birds still sing, and the human spirit, however battered, still yearns for a better tomorrow. Will you be able to carry on in this world? Can you endure the horrors of medieval Europe, where every breath could be your last? Or will you succumb to the relentless grip of diseases that defined an era? The choice, as always, is yours. Let us know in the comments if you think you could survive a day in medieval Europe. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe for more historical adventures. Thanks for watching. Welcome to my channel, where today we're going to explore what life was like during a time when justice was untamed about fairness. It was about power, cruelty, and spectacle. That's right, we're taking you back to medieval Europe, a time when the law was as deadly as any disease. Now, before we begin our journey into the dark heart of medieval justice, let me ask you a question. What was the first thing that came to your mind when you heard the phrase, medieval justice? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your response might offer a glimpse into how people perceived justice in those times. In the medieval period, justice wasn't a blindfolded lady holding a scale. She was a vengeful deity, swift and brutal. No one, not even the most influential nobles, was safe. So let's dive into this terrifying tale. One of the most terrifying aspects of medieval justice was the concept of trial by ordeal. Imagine a court proceeding where the decision of guilt or innocence wasn't based on evidence or reason, but on fire. That's exactly what happened during the ordeal of fire. In this insane system, the accused was forced to walk barefoot across a path of red-hot plowshares or hold a burning iron. If their skin was burned, they were guilty. Not, they were innocent. Doesn't sound like a fair trial, does it? The worst part, no one cared if the accused died from burns or infections afterward. This justice was a terrifying spectacle meant to terrify the populace while leaving the accused at the mercy of chance. Why stop there? Medieval justice didn't. Public executions were common, designed to show off the king's power. Some executions were like a performance, a gruesome one, though, meant to entertain the crowd. For example, executing a traitor might involve being hanged, drawn, and quartered. That's hanging the victim until almost dead, then cutting out their insides and slicing their body into pieces to be shown off publicly. Can you imagine the level of sadism present in such a scenario? The person responsible for these gruesome tasks was the executioner. They had one of the worst jobs in medieval society. They carried out these horrible punishments, often without a quick death. The executioner's job was to make an example out of the condemned, sending a message to the crowd watching, whether it was a traitor, a thief, or someone who went against the king. The executioner made sure the punishment fit the crime. And sadly, some public executions were more like a show than a punishment. People would attend these events not just out of morbid curiosity, but almost like it was a fun day out. However, this wasn't the end of the story. Medieval justice liked to drag things out. Punishments were not just harsh, they were prolonged and inhumane. Torture was common, often to get the accused to confess, even if it was a lie. The rack was a popular torture device, stretching the victim's body until their bones were almost broken. Imagine being stretched out, dislocated limbs, and devices like the Iron Maiden, which slowly impaled the victim. This wasn't just punishment, it was also a way to get information. Because according to the medieval mindset, anyone who endured such pain must be guilty. And here's the kicker. Medieval justice wasn't just harsh on the accused or criminals. It was also extremely unfair. Those who didn't have enough money or power were especially vulnerable. A peasant couldn't expect the same fair trial as a noble. In fact, they could be punished without one. Showing disrespect to a noble or questioning the monarchy could get you in big trouble. For peasants, it was a risky business. Women had it even worse. A woman accused of witchcraft or adultery could face torture, execution, or even be forced into servitude. Their lives were controlled by the whims of the powerful men around them, and justice was something they rarely experienced. Imagine living in a world where every action is controlled by the fear of severe punishment. That was the reality of medieval Europe. Medieval justice was all about control and power. It wasn't about fairness or justice. It was a tool to maintain order through terror. It was a system that allowed the powerful to control the weak, where survival meant following the rules and hoping for the best. As we wrap up our journey through medieval justice, let's take a moment to appreciate the progress we've made. Today, public executions and torture are unacceptable. But it's essential to remember that once upon a time, this was the norm. If you enjoyed this video, check out other similar videos. And don't forget to subscribe for more historical tales. Also, let us know in the comments what you find most shocking about medieval justice. Thanks for watching. The Black Death has killed millions. Europe is still reeling from the plague, but it's not the only thing to worry about. Now the weather is turning, days are getting colder, and the threat of starvation looms large. Winter is coming, and with it the risk of famine. Just like today, the weather doesn't care about your history, culture, or who's in power. If it doesn't rain, crops fail. If it rains too much, crops drown. And if it's just too darn cold, crops freeze. But unlike our modern world, medieval peasants couldn't just pop down to the supermarket for some supplies. They couldn't call up a food bank or rely on a government program to make sure they didn't starve. No, back then it was every person for themselves. If you were born a peasant, the odds were stacked against you. So let us paint a picture of what it would be like to survive a day in the bleak, hunger-ridden landscapes of medieval Europe right after this. You wake up before dawn, your empty stomach growling louder than any rooster. Today's another day closer to the dreaded winter. Another day where you must fight to stay alive. As a peasant in medieval Europe, your day starts with hunger. Your last meal was yesterday, maybe, and the one before that, who knows? But you have to keep going. If there's work to do, crops to salvage, and you can't let your Lord find you slacking off. So you rise and you head to the fields. hoping the upcoming harvest will bring reprieve from this endless hunger. As you work, you think of your family, their faces pale with hunger, their eyes hollow. Their bodies are wasting away, and you fear each night they'll become too weak to survive. You try to ignore the gnawing in your own belly, the weakness in your limbs, the cold that seeps into your bones. You have to keep moving. The alternative, staying still, is to feel the icy fingers of death wrap around you and pull you down into the dark. Finally, the work is done. You return home, the meager spoils of your labor clutched in your hands. Maybe you've managed to gather some dried herbs or salvage a few rotten vegetables. Food fit for a starving man, perhaps, but something to stave off the worst of the hunger for now. Dinner tonight might be a bowl of thin soup made from whatever you and your neighbors have been able to scrounge up. Or it might be nothing. As darkness falls, you gather with your family, sharing stories to take your mind off the gnawing in your stomachs. You tell tales of bravery, of lords and ladies feasting in their castles, oblivious to the hunger that stalks the land. You laugh, you cry, you dream of a better tomorrow. All the while knowing that tomorrow is just another day closer to winter. Another day where the sun's warmth is a luxury and food is a distant memory. The nights are cold, and you huddle with your family, trying to keep warm. Sleep is a blessed distraction, and when you dream of food. Of a world where the crops grow fat and the harvest is bountiful, where the rivers run with milk and the fields are piled high with grain. But morning comes, and with it, the stark reality of your existence. Another day of toiling in the fields, another day of hunger, another day in the cruel game of survival. And you wonder, will it ever end? Will there ever be a day when the sun shines a little warmer, when the crops grow a little fatter, when there's a little more to eat? Or is this the new world order? Is this the existence that humans are destined for? The endless struggle against hunger, the daily battle against the cold, the constant fear of winter, and the gnawing ache of an empty stomach. These are the realities of your life. Surviving a day in medieval Europe during a famine was a monumental task. It required a Herculean effort, a strength that defied logic, a tenacity that bordered on obsession. To last a day meant blocking out the gnawing hunger, ignoring the protests of your body, pushing through exhaustion and despair, all with the hope that tomorrow would be better. It meant facing the cold with a heart that had turned to ice, enduring the stares of your starving neighbors without a shred of pity. It meant living on the edge of oblivion, forever teetering between life and the icy embrace of death. In the unforgiving realm of medieval Europe, nestled amidst towering castles and dense forests, lay a quaint village seemingly untouched by the turmoil of war. However, beneath its tranquil facade, the specter of violence loomed ever present, casting long shadows over the lives of its inhabitants. For within this seemingly idyllic setting, whispers of an impending invasion had begun to circulate, sending ripples of fear and uncertainty throughout the community. Peasants hurried through the village square, their faces etched with worry as they exchanged anxious glances and hushed rumors. The blacksmith, his hammer momentarily abandoned, leaned against his workbench, his brow furrowed with concern. The village elder, his face lined with years of wisdom and strife, sat slumped in a chair, his eyes distant as he contemplated the impending threat. A young mother clutched her child close, seeking solace in their innocent embrace as she pondered the horrors that war might bring. All around, the once bucolic setting was transformed into a crucible of fear, where the simple joys of life were overshadowed by the looming specter of violence. As dusk settled over the village, casting long shadows that danced ominously in the flickering lamplight, the villagers gathered in the town square, their faces pale and drawn, their voices hushed but resolute as they grappled with the gravity of their fate. Suddenly, a piercing scream shattered the night. The villagers froze, their hearts pounding in unison, as the horrifying realization dawned upon them. It was the signal they had dreaded, the harbinger of their impending doom. In that moment, their worst fears were confirmed. The invading army was upon them. Panic surged through the crowd, and the peaceful facade of the village crumbled, revealing the raw terror that lay beneath. Fathers clutched their children close, desperately seeking to shield their innocence with their own bodies. Mothers gathered their children, rushing them towards the safety of the village elder's house. where they huddled together, praying for a miracle that seemed increasingly unlikely. As the screams and shouts of the invaders echoed through the streets, the villagers understood that their idyllic way of life was about to be shattered. With the invaders at the gates, the villagers knew that their fate hung in the balance. Some, paralyzed by fear, could only watch as their world turned upside down. Others, driven by desperation, fled into the dark recesses of the forest, hoping to escape the impending carnage. But the vast majority, their faces grim and determined, rallied together, resolved to defend their homes and their families with whatever means they could muster. Farmers grabbed pitchforks and tools, cobblers pulled out their mallets and knives, and housewives wielded pots and pans, creating an arsenal of makeshift weapons against the approaching darkness. Women and children, their faces streaked with tears and grime, joined the ranks, their small hands gripping whatever they could find, their innocence lost in the face of the approaching storm. As the first rays of dawn pierced through the darkness, the village elder stood surveying the scene before him. His heart heavy with both sorrow and pride. Round him, the remnants of the village gathered, their faces bearing the indelible marks of the previous night's ordeal. Homes were burnt and destroyed, corpses lay strewn across the ground, and the air was thick with the stench of death and decay. Yet amidst the ruins, the spirit of the villagers shone through, their bonds of community strengthened by the shared trauma of their experience. With a deep breath, the village elder raised his voice, calling for silence and attention. Before him stood the villagers, their faces etched with grief, their bodies weary from the long night of defense. Yet their eyes, though filled with sadness, also shone with a newfound determination and resilience. As the village elder began to speak, his voice echoing through the ruins of the town square, the villagers listened intently, drawing strength from his words. They understood that while their village might be in ruins and their hearts heavy with loss, they were alive. They had survived the horrors of the night, and that in itself was a victory worth cherishing. Together, they began the arduous task of rebuilding their lives, their spirits unbroken, their determination unyielding. As days turned into weeks and weeks into months, the village slowly began to heal. New homes were built, replacing the ones destroyed, and laughter once again echoed through the streets. The scars of the past remained, but so did the indomitable spirit of the villagers, a testament to the resilience of the human soul in the face of unimaginable adversity. For centuries, medieval Europe was a world dominated by an unrelenting force, an entity so powerful that it seeped into every facet of life, dictating how people lived, worked, worshipped, and ultimately died. It was an institution that held the keys to heaven and hell, an institution that shaped not just the spiritual destiny, but the very survival of millions. We're talking about the medieval church, an institution whose reach extended far beyond the realm of religion. The medieval church was an absolute monarchy, supreme over all secular authority. Its power wasn't merely political or social, it was divine. And in this context, the word divine is best understood in its literal sense. The medieval church believed it represented God on earth, giving it the authority to interpret his will and punish those who disobeyed. For the commoner, survival in this world wasn't just about avoiding disease, famine, or war. It was also about appeasing an omnipresent and powerful religious authority that could condemn you for the smallest transgressions, real or imagined. One of the most terrifying aspects of medieval religion was the concept of heresy. To be branded a heretic was one of the worst fates imaginable. Heretics were those who deviated from the official teachings of the church, those who dared to question or reject the doctrines of the faith. This could include anything from believing that the earth was round to subscribing to certain unorthodox religious views. Whatever it was, the heretic became an enemy of God, a threat to the very fabric of society, someone who needed to be rooted out and punished. Accusations of heresy could come from anyone, and often the mere suspicion was enough to condemn you. Neighbors, envious of your property, or disgruntled former servants could accuse you without consequence. Heresy, like many other crimes during the period, was largely decided on the basis of circumstantial evidence and confessions extracted through torture. Once accused, your fate was sealed. The church had established a tribunal to root out heresy known as the Inquisition, which commenced operations in the 12th century. The methods used by the Inquisition were brutal, designed not just to extract confessions, but to instill fear in the hearts of all who heard about them. Inquisitors would arrive in a town unannounced, demanding access to every house and the right to interrogate everyone. Men, women, and even children were questioned about their neighbors and fellow townspeople, creating an atmosphere of paranoia and distrust. Anyone who could account for their neighbor's behavior or who could provide satisfactory answers about their faith was likely to be arrested. The accused were then taken to special facilities where they were subjected to intense interrogation sessions, sometimes lasting for days or weeks. They were deprived of food and sleep, beaten, tortured, and even burned until they confessed to heresy or renounced it publicly. Those found guilty were often executed in public, sometimes burned alive at the stake. Their possessions were confiscated and their families shunned by the community. But it wasn't just heresy that made you vulnerable. The medieval church also created a culture of fear around sin. Every aspect of life was governed by the church's doctrine, and every action was scrutinized. Eating meat on Fridays, killing animals on Sundays, having sex outside of marriage, and even using God's name in vain were all considered grave sins. And it wasn't uncommon for individuals to be publicly shamed for these offenses. Public penance was a common punishment where the sinner was forced to perform humiliating acts in front of the entire town. Fines, imprisonment, and excommunication were also regularly used. And if that wasn't enough, there was always the threat of damnation, the idea of spending eternity in hell. And all of this was a part of a grand strategy to maintain control, a control that permeated every aspect of medieval life, leaving no room for individuality, questioning, or dissent. The church's influence wasn't limited to the common folk. Kings and queens also had to answer to the church. While monarchs had immense power, they were also subject to the pope's authority. Papal bulls, decrees issued by the pope, could overturn royal edicts, depose kings, and even absolve subjects from their oaths of loyalty. It may seem hard to believe now, but this was the reality of medieval Europe. A world where survival meant total submission to the church. A world where every moment of your life was controlled by an institution that held the promise of heaven and the threat of hell in its hands. The medieval church wasn't just a religious institution, it was a way of life, whether you liked it or not. Your head pounds, your throat is sore, and you feel like death is coming for you. Stumble into the local doctor's office, hoping for some relief. But what if instead of finding a cure, you found your doom? Welcome to my channel. And today let's find out how you might die in medieval Europe. In medieval Europe, the art of healing was less an art and more a gamble. The medical practices of the time were so unpredictable that a visit to the physician could be a death sentence. The most prevalent theory in medicine at the time was the humoral theory, which posited that health was determined by the balance of 4 fluids or humors in the body: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Now imagine your doctor treating you based on these humors. It's exactly what was happening in medieval Europe. If you had a fever, they would induce vomiting or diarrhea to get rid of the excess humor. And if you had a cough, they might make you swallow mercury or take a hot bath until you collapsed from exhaustion. It was a time when bizarre treatments were commonplace, and danger lurked around every medical procedure. Bloodletting was one of the most widespread treatments employed by medieval physicians. They believed that illness was caused by an imbalance of these 4 humors, and blood was often the culprit. To rebalance your humors, they would open a vein and drain your blood, usually without anesthesia. Imagine being cut open without any pain relief. The whole procedure was not only excruciating, but it was also dangerous. The instruments used for bloodletting were rarely clean, and the loss of blood could weaken you enough to succumb to other illnesses. If you were already sick, that is, bloodletting could hasten your death. And even if you were healthy, you could die from the treatment. But bloodletting wasn't the only way they tried to balance your humors. There was also purging, which involved making you vomit or have diarrhea. They believed that getting rid of the bad humors would restore your health. For this, they used foul-smelling herbs, toxic plants, or even made you drink the water from stale urine. Just think about the irony. You go to the doctor because you're ill, and the treatment makes you even sicker. If you weren't careful and ended up in the wrong hands, a simple headache could land you in a coffin. Imagine going for a cure and coming back dead. That was the risk you took in medieval medicine. The treatments were so barbaric that you were better off enduring the pain than submitting to the supposed cures. Surgical procedures were another gamble. Surgeries like wound treatments, hernia repairs, and amputations were risky without anesthesia or proper antiseptics. Surgeons often caused more harm than good, leaving patients with lifelong disabilities, or worse. And if that wasn't enough, after the surgery, there was the wait for the inevitable infection to set in. So you survived the surgery, but how long could you survive the infection? In the absence of antibiotics, even a minor wound could turn deadly. In fact, your odds of survival in medieval Europe were grim. Infant mortality was high, as was the mortality rate for mothers during childbirth. People were dying left and right, not just from plagues and epidemics, but also from everyday life. The risk of death loomed over everyone, regardless of social status. Imagine you're a peasant in medieval Europe. You wake up every day before sunrise, knowing that your back aches from yesterday's labor in the fields. You have a nagging cough, but you can't afford to see the doctor. You don't have to. Remedies are more likely to kill you than cure you. Instead, you try home remedies or turn to a local wise woman, hoping for relief. Wise women were often persecuted as witches, and even if they helped you, their methods were often viewed with suspicion. For the rich, the situation was slightly better, but no less risky. They could afford the best doctors and treatments, but those treatments were still dangerous and ineffective. The doctors of the wealthy were often no better than those of the poor. Their knowledge of medicine was limited, and they were just as likely to cause harm as good. So what were your chances of survival in medieval Europe? If you were lucky, you might live to old age, never having seen a doctor or needing one. But if you did need medical help, your odds were grim. Bloodletting, purging, painful surgeries, and a lack of understanding of basic hygiene meant that every medical encounter was a potential death sentence. The medieval world was full of dangers, and your health was at the mercy of both nature and doctors, whose treatments were more likely to kill you than cure you. It was a time when science took a back seat to superstition, and where survival was the greatest victory one could hope for. Thank you for watching. Until next time. Did you know that life in medieval Europe was a daily battle for survival? Yes, survival of the fittest, like the saying goes. But why? What makes this era so harsh? Let's find out. Life in medieval Europe was not just about knights and kings. It was also about the common folk who made up the vast majority of the population. Their lives were tough, and getting tougher by the minute. I'm not talking about the occasional hard time. I'm talking about the everyday grind. Imagine you're one of those nameless, faceless peasants. Your day starts at the crack of dawn, not because you want to start your day early, but because you have to. You have crops to plant, animals to feed, and a lord to please. No time for sleeping in. As soon as the sun peaks over the horizon, you're up and at M. You spend your days toiling in the fields, planting, weeding, and harvesting. The soil doesn't care how hard your life is. It needs to be tilled. The crops need to be sown. The sun beats down on your back, and the only sound is the monotonous chirping of crickets. Where are the painkillers when you need them? The work doesn't end at sunset. You've got chores to do, meals to cook, animals to tend to. Maybe you've got kids to look after, too. And let's not forget, a fire needs to be kept going to keep the wild animals away from your home. And yes, we all need to eat, don't we? Small fire is essential to keeping alive in these dark times. With insufficient lighting and rampant crime, you can't afford to relax even after a long day's work. If your lord feels generous, he might let you keep a portion of what you grow, but the bigger share often goes to him. And if you don't give him what he wants, you'll face his wrath. Now, the Black Death has come and gone, but the memory of its devastation lingers like a bad smell. People are wary and fearful. There isn't a shred of hope for a better life, and the prospect of another plague sweeping through the countryside fills them with dread. Back then, knowledge about diseases was limited. The cause of the plague, they believed, was an imbalance of the four humors in the body. So how did they treat it? Well, they tried everything from leeching, which is sucking out blood, to applying animal fat to the affected area. None of it worked. The Black Death was a nightmare from which they never woke up, and it took millions of lives in its wake. Medieval Europe was a melting pot of religions, cultures, and languages. And guess what? They all had one thing in common: a deep-rooted belief in God. Religion was deeply ingrained in their lives. The Catholic Church held significant sway over the people. Let me tell you, they weren't shy about exercising that influence. Priests and popes were seen as God's representatives on earth, and they commanded respect and obedience. The church was a towering presence, casting long shadows over people's lives. And the clergy was not hesitant to use its power. If you didn't toe the line, you could expect some serious consequences. Not only would you face God's wrath, but you'd also have to deal with the earthly repercussions handed down by the church. And trust me, you don't want to mess with them. Warfare and violence were also a part of daily life. Conflicts between kingdoms in the Crusades were a regular occurrence. This meant that not only were people killed in battles, but entire communities could be wiped out. Disease and famine were constant threats. The lack of basic medical knowledge and unsanitary conditions led to the spread of diseases. When outbreaks occurred, they could decimate entire populations. Famine was also a grim visitor, often brought on by bad weather or crop failure. It left people desperate for food, leading to starvation and misery. So let me ask you, how would you feel waking up every morning not knowing if you'd make it through the day? That was the reality of life in medieval Europe. It wasn't just a historical event you read about in books. It was a testament to the resilience of the human spirit in the face of unimaginable odds. So next time you think your day is tough, just remember it could have been way worse. You could have been living in medieval Europe. Thanks for watching and see you in the next video. Now, you might wonder why I'm sharing such grim tales. It's not to scare you, but to make you think. To make you realize just how good your life is right now, however tough things may seem. You have no idea what it's like to wake up every morning wondering if you'll make it through the day. To live in a world where a simple cough could mean your death, where a cut could turn into a fatal infection, and where the threat of war hangs heavy in the air. This was the reality for the average medieval peasant. Medieval Europe, a time when life was cheap and death was everywhere. For many, the medieval era seems like a distant fairy tale, a time of brave knights and beautiful princesses. But for most people, life back then was anything but a fairy tale. It was a struggle for survival. Your life had little value. You didn't have rights or freedoms like we do today. The world was full of danger. Whether you were a poor farmer or a rich lord, life was unpredictable and violent. Knights weren't around to protect you, and sometimes they were the ones causing trouble. It was a world where being born meant you lost a coin toss with death. If you survived infancy, you might live to see 40, but there was no guarantee. Disease, war, and hunger could kill you at any time. Kings and queens weren't safe either. Just imagine being King Charles VI, having a crown that makes you the ruler of England, only to have someone else take it away because you have no kids. That's exactly what happened to him. He was born in 1368, became king in 1429, died in 1485 without producing an heir. So his cousin, Henry Tudor, took the throne after beating him in battle. That's how it went for some of the most powerful people around. Now you might say, hey, at least I don't have to worry about being beheaded. Well, hold on, because even the royal family wasn't safe from getting axed. Think of King Charles the Bold. He ruled over 3 duchies and wanted more power. But in 1477, he got into a massive fight with the Swiss and got killed. Then there was Elizabeth, Queen of England. She had a rough time too. Her cousin, Lady Jane Grey, tried to take the throne when Elizabeth was only 17. Can you imagine? Luckily, Elizabeth became queen at the age of 25 and ruled for 45 years. But that wasn't easy either. She faced rebellions and plots to take her crown. But here's the thing. Whether you were a pauper or a potentate, life in medieval Europe was nothing short of hellish. Now let me tell you about Richard III. He was the last Plantagenet king of England. His father, Richard, Duke of York, fought a civil war to take the throne from Henry VI. But after Richard's death in battle, his elder brother Edward IV seized the crown. When Edward died suddenly, Richard found himself on the throne in 1483. But his happiness didn't last long. Henry Tudor defeated him at the Battle of Bosworth, field in 1485. Richard was killed in the battle, and his body was thrown into a ditch. They even wrote a song about how he died, so much for being a king. You might think, well, I'm not royalty, so my life is totally different. But guess again. Back in medieval Europe, if your boss didn't like you, you could get in serious trouble. Talk about a nightmare scenario. I mean, imagine going to work and your boss just decides to throw you in jail because he doesn't like your face. Yeah, that happened back then. People were killed for just about anything. Sometimes they accused innocent people of being witches and burned them at the stake. Others were executed just because they didn't follow the king's rules. And believe it or not, some people got arrested for looking at the king the wrong way. So if you think your life is tough, consider this. At least you can watch this video and learn about crazy stuff that happened in the past. It's back in the Middle Ages. If you were caught stealing food to survive, they might put you to death. It was a dangerous time to be alive. With deadly diseases spreading around, poverty and famine, life was a gamble. And if you didn't win, well, you didn't win. So if you're alive, that's already a victory. So count your blessings and remember, things could always be worse. You could be living in the Middle Ages.